Imagine a warship born of sheer cunning, built to circumvent international rules. This aircraft carrier, named RYUJO, came into existence defying strict treaties designed to curb Japan's naval expansion. Yet with astonishing ingenuity, Japanese engineers found a loophole in those very restrictions. They exploited every line of the document to create a true maritime phantom, a vessel that, officially, had no right to exist. The Ryujo became a stark symbol of how far the Japanese Empire was willing to go in its quest for naval dominance. This audacious maneuver marked the beginning of the illegal Dragon's story, a vessel destined to challenge American forces and ultimately pay for it with its own life. By the mid-1920s, Tokyo was consumed by a feverish desire to prove to the world that Japan was a great power, unconstrained by any limits. The Washington Naval Treaty, signed in 1922, was intended to halt the naval arms race indefinitely. Each nation was allocated strict limits on battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. But the Japanese military had no intention of accepting these terms. They studied the treaty in minute detail and discovered a loophole. A ship with a displacement of less than 10,000 tons was not formally classified as an aircraft carrier. It was a brilliant solution. On paper, such a ship would appear small, but in reality, it would become a full-fledged aviation platform. Thus began the RYUJO project. At the Yokohama shipyard, engineers secretly embarked on designing a new vessel that would become a symbol of Japan's audacity and technical inventiveness. 8,000 tons displacement, and it already moved beyond the classifications stipulated by the treaty. The United States and Great Britain did not yet realize the clever game the Japanese were playing. While international experts reported control over naval forces, in reality, a storm was brewing in Japan. RYUJO, meaning prancing dragon, was designed to carry dozens of aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. This was no longer a small auxiliary platform, but a true warship. The Japanese understood perfectly that aircraft carriers would be the weapon of the future, but no one expected the first of them to take to the water like a criminal, having tricked the law. In this story, we will follow the RYUJO's journey from its clandestine construction to its final, tragic battle. This is a tale of cunning, audacity, and the dramatic end of a ship that should not have existed. By the late 1920s, tensions in Japan were steadily rising. Militarists demanded a stronger fleet, and engineers and admirals sought ways to circumvent the new restrictions. When it became clear that the loophole worked, the Imperial Fleet Command issued an order to begin construction as soon as possible, before the world caught on to the Japanese ruse. Design began in 1926, but serious work only started in late 1929. That's when the keel of the future aircraft carrier RYUJO was laid at the famous Yokohama shipyard. The Japanese knew that any delay could cost them the opportunity, as a new treaty was already being prepared in London that could permanently close the loophole they had found. Initially, the ship was planned to be light, just 8,000 tons displacement, with a single hangar and minimal protection. Armor was virtually non-existent. The hull was thin, and engine room protection was limited to plating. For the sake of weight reduction, everything was sacrificed, even the superstructure. The RYUJO had no conventional island command center. Instead, the navigation bridge was hidden directly beneath the forward edge of the flight deck, in a sort of glass greenhouse. It looked unusual but saved precious tons of weight. Initially, its hangars were planned to accommodate only a dozen torpedo bombers and a few fighters. But during construction, the appetites of Japanese admirals grew. They demanded to increase the number of aircraft by almost 4 times, bringing it to 48. For this, engineers hastily built a second hangar above the first. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake. The narrow hull and high decks made the ship extremely unstable. Even the most experienced sailors knew, in a storm, it would be tossed around like an empty tin can. When the new naval treaty was signed in London in 1930, explicitly prohibiting such loopholes, it was already too late. The RYUJO was on the slipway, and no one intended to stop its construction. Moreover, The Japanese command now realized they would possess a unique, one-of-a-kind ship. It was to be both a symbol of deception and proof that Japan was willing to go to any length for naval power. By the spring of 1931, the hull was launched, and the world saw the prancing dragon for the first time. But beneath the impressive name lay serious problems that would repeatedly make themselves known in the future. When the Ryujo was launched and the first trials began, the joy of the Japanese admirals quickly turned to alarm. The ship proved to be extremely unstable. Its narrow hull and high silhouette, caused by the second hangar, turned the aircraft carrier into a true sea acrobat, tossed around like a wooden boat on stormy days. Even powerful gyroscopic stabilizers, installed to maintain balance, couldn't rectify the situation. Sailors who served on the Ryujo recalled that every trip into the open sea felt like a test of fate. Wind and waves made the deck literally sway, and aircraft takeoffs and landings became risky ventures. Planes had to land with pinpoint precision, as the slightest error could result in a plunge into the water. The situation became particularly alarming in 1934, when a tragedy occurred with the Japanese torpedo boat Tamazu. This relatively small vessel capsized in a storm, claiming the lives of many sailors. It was a shock in Japan. Admirals realized that many new ships suffered from the same problems as the Ryujo. Large-scale fleet inspections began urgently. As a result, the commission concluded that the Ryujo was on the verge of acceptable stability. If measures weren't taken, it risked repeating the Tamazuru's fate in the first strong storm. It was then decided to strengthen its keel, add ballast to the holds, and install anti-torpedo bulges. This made the ship slightly heavier, but gave it a chance to survive in the open ocean. However, the core problem remained. The deck was still too low, and the hull too narrow. Even after modifications, the Ryujo was considered only conditionally safe. In the Japanese fleet, this aircraft carrier was often called dancing on the waves, indicating its tendency to sway even in slight swells, as if it were trying to dance to the rhythm of the elements. Nevertheless, the Imperial fleet could not afford to abandon a ship that had already been built. The Ryujo continued to be prepared for service, undergoing trials, improving landing systems, and striving to maximize its potential despite its design problems. It was an unusual aircraft carrier with a vulnerable design, yet to prove its combat effectiveness. The Ryujo's true military life began in 1935, when Japan entered the open phase of war against China. After several modernizations, designed to at least partially correct its flaws, the aircraft carrier received an updated air group consisting of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. It was then that the command decided to test it in action. In August 1937, the Ryujo, along with other carriers of the 1st Division, arrived off the coast of China. Its mission was crystal clear: support for ground forces advancing on Shanghai. Taking off from the deck of the Prancing Dragon, Japanese dive bombers struck Chinese airfields and fortifications. Their goal was to deprive the enemy of air cover and ensure the Japanese army freedom of action on the ground. One of the first targets was an airfield northwest of Shanghai. The attack was lightning fast. Japanese bombers destroyed runways and hangars. However, on their way back, they were intercepted by Chinese Curtiss Hawk III fighters. Despite fierce aerial combat, the Japanese managed to shoot down 2 enemy aircraft and return without losses. This was a signal. The Ryujo was ready for real battles. In the following weeks, the aircraft carrier repeatedly launched its squadrons. Its planes struck positions around Shanghai and then Canton. Chinese aviation tried to resist, but Japanese pilots gradually gained air superiority. The Ryujo proved to be a useful link in the fleet. Although considered an unstable ship, its planes delivered tangible results. In the autumn of the same year, some of its aircraft were transferred directly to ground airfields to support the advance on Nanjing. Thus, the aircraft carrier effectively became a temporary airbase from which pilots flew deep into the mainland. After this campaign, the Ryujo was also used as a training ship, preparing new pilots for the fleet. But by the late 1930s, it was returned to combat duty. Old biplanes were replaced with modern Mitsubishi monoplanes, and the ship itself remained in service, despite all its weaknesses. These battles were the RYUJO's first serious experience. The illegal dragon, born from a treaty loophole, tasted war for the first time and proved that even with design flaws, it could play a significant role in battles. Late 1939 marked a period of change for the Ryujo and preparation for much larger battles. After its engagements in China, the ship returned to the shipyard for another modernization. This time, engineers paid special attention to the flight deck, elevators, and aircraft control systems. Simultaneously, the Japanese command decided to update the air group. Outdated biplanes were replaced by modern single-engine monoplanes, Mitsubishi Claude fighters, and Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers. Now, aircraft with performance comparable to Western counterparts were preparing to take off from the deck of the prancing dragon. The ship's crew increasingly participated in exercises. Night takeoffs, massed attacks on naval formations, covering landings, and even simulated airfield raids were practiced. The Japanese fleet clearly understood that a coming war with the United States was only a matter of time. The aircraft carrier itself, despite all its instability, was considered a valuable asset. Its relative lightness allowed for quick maneuvering, and the number of aircraft based on board became quite comparable to heavier carriers. The Ryujo was often used as a division flagship, further enhancing its prestige among sailors. In early 1940, the Ryujo underwent its third major modernization. It now had more powerful anti-aircraft armament, new Type 96 25mm autocannons, and improved aviation fuel storage systems. All this indicated that the ship was preparing for war against a strong and dangerous adversary. The sailors and pilots who served on it noted the carrier's special spirit. They knew their ship was born of deception and cunning, but they perceived this as a symbol of Japanese ingenuity and determination. The Ryujo became a kind of challenge to the whole world. It should not have existed, yet it did, and now was about to play an important role in the coming war. By the autumn of 1941, the Ryujo was part of the Imperial Fleet's 4th Carrier Division. Its crew was fully ready, aircraft were equipped, and the command was developing plans for upcoming operations. Within weeks, the Ryujo would enter battle in the Pacific, where it would test its strength against the Americans and their allies. December 1941 became a point of no return for the Ryujo. The world was already engulfed in flames, and Japan opened a new, grand chapter of the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the United States, and the Imperial Fleet launched offensives across the Pacific region. The Ryujo was among the ships tasked with supporting the first operations against the Allies. On December 8th, just hours after the attack on Hawaii, the prancing dragon's deck came alive. Torpedo bombers and fighters took off, heading for the Philippines. Their target was the American base in Davao on Mindanao Island. The Japanese struck warehouses, airfields, and ship anchorages. The Ryujo's air group contributed to the destruction of American infrastructure and paralyzed their defenses in the southern Philippines. The ship was then redeployed to the Malay Peninsula. Here, Japanese forces advanced rapidly overland, and the Ryujo provided them with air cover and support. Its dive bombers attacked ammunition depots and British troop convoys, while fighters ensured air superiority. Although the ship was considered light and vulnerable, its aircraft operated effectively, instilling serious fear in the Allies. On March 1, 1942, the Ryujo participated in one of the decisive episodes of the campaign, the Second Battle of the Java Sea. Its torpedo bombers attacked the American destroyer USS Pope. After a fierce battle, the ship was abandoned by its crew, and it was planes from the Ryujo that delivered the final blow, sending the enemy to the bottom. This episode symbolized that even an illegal aircraft carrier could deliver deadly strikes to the enemy. In the spring of the same year, the Ryujo joined the 1st Air Fleet and was sent to the Indian Ocean. Here, its mission was to disrupt British maritime communications. Its aircraft attacked the ports of Kakinada and Visakhapatnam in India, sinking merchant ships and damaging several other vessels. Additionally, along with the cruisers and destroyers accompanying it. The Prancing Dragon achieved several more victories through artillery fire. These operations demonstrated that, despite all its design flaws, the Ryujo had become a fully functional instrument of war. Its presence in battle formations strengthened the fleet, and its success in raids boosted the morale of Japanese sailors. But at the same time, the Allies were increasingly adapting to the new reality, the dominance of aircraft carriers. And each battle brought closer the moment when the Ryujo would have to face an equally powerful adversary. The spring of 1942 transformed the Ryujo into a nomadic hunter. Along with cruisers and destroyers, it joined a task force operating in the Indian Ocean. The objectives were clear and ruthless: disrupt British sea lanes, sink merchant ships, and terrorize ports. It was here that the Prancing Dragon first proved itself not only as an aircraft carrier, but as a true naval raider. Ryujo's aircraft attacked the ports of Kakinada and Visakhapatnam. Fighters and torpedo bombers, taking off from its relatively small deck, sped toward coastal targets, striking warehouses and docks. The Japanese claimed to have sunk 2 merchant ships and damaged 6 more. Furthermore, in cooperation with the cruisers and destroyers escorting the carrier, several more vessels were destroyed by artillery fire. Alarm spread through British waters. The small Japanese aircraft carrier had thrown established sea routes into chaos. But the more the Ryujo operated, the more obvious its weaknesses became. Design flaws hadn't disappeared, even after modifications. The narrow hull and high superstructure still made the ship a dancer on the waves. Naval engineers reinforced its torpedo protection, installing additional Type 96 25mm autocannons. But the sailors knew that in a serious engagement with an equal adversary, Ryujo's chances of survival would be slim. Nevertheless, the Japanese command had no intention of keeping the ship in the shadows. After its last refit, it was assigned a new mission: to attack the Aleutian Islands. In the summer of 1942, the Ryujo, along with other ships of the fleet, headed into the cold waters of the northern Pacific. Its air group struck American positions, supporting the Japanese landing. However, historians later noted that this operation was primarily a diversion. While Allied attention was drawn to the Aleutian Islands, Japan's main forces were preparing for the battle off Midway Atoll. Thus, the Ryujo found itself further and further from the center of events. It was used where heavy aircraft carriers were considered too risky. Sailors felt that their ship, though combat-ready, was still a weak link in the fleet. With each passing month, it became clearer. The moment was coming when the Prancing Dragon would face its strongest enemy, and its vulnerabilities would become deadly. The summer of 1942 brought cold winds and gray fogs for the Ryujo. Along with a Japanese task force, it found itself off the Aleutian Islands. The operation here had a dual objective: to strike American bases and, simultaneously, to divert attention from the main battle at Midway Atoll, where the heavy aircraft carriers were concentrated. The Prancing Dragon's aircraft struck airfields and coastal fortifications. Fighters patrolled the sky, and dive bombers dropped bombs on strongholds and warehouses. American garrisons on the Aleutians felt the full force of the Japanese offensive. But for the Ryujo itself, this campaign became more than just fulfilling orders. Here, it first became evident that it was not being used as an equal to heavy carriers, but as an auxiliary force deployable for secondary tasks. Conversations about the future increasingly filled the ship's deck. Sailors understood. Their carrier couldn't compare to the Shokaku or Zuikaku. The Ryujo remained the illegal child of a clever deception, built-in circumvention of the treaty. Now, it was becoming a convenient tool for secondary operations. But the war developed in such a way that even auxiliary forces could find themselves in the thick of the fighting. Japanese pilots noted the harsh conditions of the Aleutian Islands: fog, wind, cold water. All this turned every takeoff and landing into a trial. But they carried out their missions, suffering losses and returning with victories. The Americans resisted, but the forces were unequal. The Northern Campaign ended in Japan's favor. though it had little strategic significance. It was here, in the northern waters, that the Ryujo's fate seemed to pause before the decisive act. The ship had not lost its combat capability, but its future trials were to be far more terrifying. For in a few weeks, the Japanese fleet was to meet the Americans off the Solomon Islands in one of the battles that would determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. August 1942 became the Ryujo's moment of truth. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, and Japan was forced to commit all its forces. Ahead lay the eastern Solomon Islands, a battle that would forever go down in naval history. On August 24th, the Prancing Dragon, as part of a task force, received orders to strike Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 16 Zero fighters and 6 Kate torpedo bombers took off. But American intelligence worked faster, and Wildcat and Aero-Cobra fighters were already circling over the island. Fies aériales combat en Suède. 9 Zeros charged into the attack, raining fire on the enemy airfield, and the Kates dropped bombs on positions. The Americans claimed 19 Japanese planes shot down, but the reality was different. The Ryujo lost only 6 aircraft. However, the main trial lay ahead. American carriers USS Saratoga and USS Enterprise had already moved into the battle area. In the early afternoon, the Americans discovered the Ryujo's task force and launched their strike groups. Soon, Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers appeared over the sea. The Ryujo's crew prepared for a desperate fight. The ship's captain maneuvered with all his might, trying to throw off the aim of enemy aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns peppered the sky with tracers, and several attacking planes plunged into the water. However, a complete escape from the attack was impossible. Enemy bombers dropped thousands of pounds of steel and fire onto the deck. 3 direct bomb hits and 1 accurate torpedo strike tore into its side. Water flooded the engine room, and fire engulfed the hangar. The deck trembled from explosions. The Ryujo continued to hold on, though it was already listing to starboard. Sailors fought for survivability, sealing breaches, pumping water, but the forces of fire and destruction proved stronger. At 3:15 p.m., the commander made the difficult decision, ordering the crew to abandon ship. The destroyer Amatsukes came to their aid, beginning to rescue the crew. American Boeing B-17 flying Fortress heavy bombers appeared in the sky, dropping bombs on the rescue area. But the Japanese managed to evacuate hundreds of sailors. The ship itself, however, was doomed. By 5:55 p.m., the Ryujo finally capsized and sank, taking with it over 120 sailors and 14 aircraft that hadn't managed to return to the deck. Thus ended the story of an aircraft carrier born in defiance of the law. The illegal Dragon fell, but it fell fighting, leaving behind a memory of the crew's bravery, who believed until the end that their ship deserved a place among the greats. The sinking of the Ryujo off the eastern Solomon Islands was not only a tragedy for its crew, but also a symbol of an entire era. This ship came into being thanks to the cunning of Japanese admirals who managed to deceive international treaties. It was initially illegal, created outside the rules, and therein lay its uniqueness. The Prancing Dragon was a challenge to the whole world, proof that Japan was willing to go to any length for its naval power. Despite its design flaws, poor stability, lack of armor, and overloaded aviation, the Ryujo had a long journey. It participated in battles against China, supported landings in the Philippines, launched strikes in the Indian Ocean, operated off the Aleutian Islands, and eventually took part in one of the decisive battles in the Pacific. In each of these episodes, its crew displayed courage, discipline, and a willingness to fight to the end, even understanding that their ship was inferior to heavy aircraft carriers in every way. For the Japanese, the Ryujo became a symbol of audacity and perseverance. Sailors called it the illegal dragon, but they imbued those words with respect, for it was he who showed that even a weak link could contribute to great victories. The Americans, conversely, saw it as a convenient target, though they underestimated its ability to resist. When the Ryujo sank in August 1942, over 120 sailors and 14 aircraft perished with it. But its memory remained. Its story is a story of cunning, struggle, and an inevitable end. It was built outside the rules, lived a life at the limits of its capabilities, and died as a warship should, in battle, surrounded by smoke, fire, and steel. Today, the Ryujo is remembered as a paradox of a ship, illegal yet real, weak yet useful, temporary yet leaving a mark on eternity. And in that lies its true legacy. It proved that even something founded on deception could become part of a great history of war.